Henshaw.
Hey, Phil.
All right. Good to see you, Phil Henshaw. Look at that beard. I like it. The beard. All right.
I thought No Shave November was in November.
We're doing a full year of it, November to November. All right. Well, let's. I'm going to share the screen real quick. Da-da-da-da. Hey! And we are going to continue on with our Old Testament survey. All right, you guys ready to launch in?
Bernie's ready.
I see Bernie.
All right. Well, let's talk a little bit. Let's do a little review of what we've done the last couple of weeks to kind of refresh and that kind of stuff. So we're working with our timeline here and our key dates. We date Abraham around 2100. Jacob's clan goes to Egypt around 1870-ish. Exodus around 1446, and the conquest. Now let's stop right there. My daughter pointed out for some people it's helpful to have a timeline. So there we go. We got a timeline. So you can look at it horizontally if you would. Okay? And so again, here you see we've got Abraham around 2100. Then we come to, they have Isaac, Jacob, Moses around 1525, the Exodus around 1445. Then this is the conquest. So they travel in the desert during this period here. Then they get to the edge of the promised land. And the book of Joshua is them taking the promised land. So that's right there. And then last week we covered this little section, the book of Judges. That was wild and crazy and nutty, the years of the judges. And then we get to these three key figures. These are the three kings of Israel when the kingdom was unified, when all 12 tribes of Israel were unified. Okay? And so that's what we covered so far till around 961, which is Solomon. And at the end of Solomon's reign, 930 is when the kingdom divides. All right. So let's kind of pause for a second. Are there any questions? Does anybody have any questions about what we've covered so far in this early part of our Old Testament overview? Just go ahead and speak up because I can't see everybody.
No.
All good? Okay. Well, what I want to do is I want to drill down into the divided kingdom a little bit, because this is a part of the Old Testament that really confuses people, okay? You have all kinds of names, and you have kings of Israel, kings of Judah, who is who, when is this going on? And so we're going to tackle this period right here from 930 till around 568, okay? And so here it is, 930 to 722 for the northern kingdom, which I'll explain in a second, and 586 for the southern kingdom. But look with me over in 1 Kings chapter 11. 1 Kings 11. Okay, so 1 Kings 11, it starts in verse 1 through 13, talking about King Solomon's unfaithfulness to God. He marries lots of foreign wives, and they lead him astray to worship other gods, which causes God to curse the nation of Israel and curse Solomon. Okay? In verse 14, it says, "Then the Lord raised up against Solomon an adversary." And so there begins to be political turmoil. So you have a guy named Hadad that's raised up, a guy named Rezin that is raised up, and a guy named Jeroboam, who is one of Solomon's key servants that raises up and opposes Solomon. Okay. Now, Jeroboam is going to be the key one that we focus in on. Look in verse 26. It says, "Also, Jeroboam, son of Nebat, rebelled against the king. He was one of King Solomon's officials, an Ephraimite from Zerida, and his mother was a widow named Zeruiah." Here's the account of how he rebelled against King Solomon. Solomon had built the terraces and had filled the gap in the wall of the city of David his father. Now, Jeroboam was a man of standing, and when Solomon saw how well the young man did his work, he put him in charge of the whole labor force of the tribes of Joseph. About that time, Jeroboam was going out of Jerusalem, and Ahijah the prophet of Shiloh met him on the way, wearing a new cloak. The two of them were alone out in the country, and Ahijah took hold of the new cloak he was wearing, and he tore it into 12 pieces. Then he said to Jeroboam, take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I'm going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes for the sake of my servant David. I won't give you all. So basically, this is a prophet of God that is prophesying to that is prophesying to Jeroboam that he is going to give Jeroboam 10 of the 12 tribes. Okay, so that's the prophecy, and then he winds up running away and then Solomon tries to kill Jeroboam because he hears about this. But think about Jeroboam. Jeroboam is not in the line of David, but Jeroboam was so talented that Solomon takes notice of him, raises him up, and then Jeroboam rebels. Jeroboam would be like Alexander Hamilton. Okay, like he's that genius, driven, talented kind of guy that from a political perspective is ambitious and winds up raising up and in fact becomes one of the two kings of the tribes of Israel. Okay, well, there's also Solomon's son who is in line to be the next king, and his name is Rehoboam. And so in 1 Kings chapter 12, what happens is after Solomon's death, the nation, all 12 tribes of Israel come to Rehoboam and they say basically, hey man, your dad forced us with a lot of labor. So are you going to lighten the load of the labor? Okay. Solomon was an aggressive builder that was done by the people. And so they basically say, are you going to lighten the load? Well, Rehoboam goes to the elders and he says, what do you think what I should do? And the elders say, yeah, you should totally lighten the load. The people will be devoted to you. They'll follow you. You'll have the nation unified, right? Then he goes to his buddies that he grew up with, and he says, what do you guys think I should do? And all of his buddies are like, no way, grind him into the dirt, show him who's boss, right? And guess who he listens to? His buddies. And so he basically goes back to Israel and he says, hey guys, you think my dad was hard? My dad, he says, my little finger is thicker than my dad's waist. My hand is going to be so heavy on you. And so basically all the people say, forget you then, we're leaving. We don't want to follow you. And they begin to follow Jeroboam. Okay. And so in chapter 12, verse 15, the king did not listen to the people for this, but this is important. In verse 15, it says, for this turn of events was from the Lord to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken to Jeroboam, son of Nebat, through Ahijah. And so this was God's plan through Rehoboam being a bonehead to divide the nation. And in so doing, he's disciplining Solomon and his line, and he is fulfilling that prophecy. Now it's interesting because what was Solomon known for? Wisdom. Yeah. Remember, one of the first things he does is a very wise ruling between two prostitutes. Remember, they come to him and they say, hey, that's my baby. And they said, all this stuff. And he does this incredibly wise ruling. He says, okay, cut the baby in half. And the real mom says, forget it. She can have the baby. And he says, you're the real mom. So his first act was incredibly wise. His son's first act was incredibly foolish. And so you see a contrast here of the kingdom, which causes it to divide in two, okay? And so in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 20 through 24, you see Rehoboam, who is the son of Solomon. So he's the rightful king in the lineage of David. Rehoboam sets up his kingdom in Jerusalem, okay? And it only includes Judah, Benjamin, and the Levites, Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about the division of the kingdoms. Well, they decide, you know what? We're going to fight the northern tribes. We're going to go after them. But in chapter 12, verse 24, it says, this is what the Lord says: do not go up to fight against your brother, the Israelites. Go home, every one of you, for this is my doing. So they obeyed the Lord and they went home again as the Lord had ordered. And so this establishes that there are now two kingdoms. Rehoboam is leading the one in the south, and then in the north, Jeroboam is leading the one in the north. Okay, so let's talk a little bit. Actually, I want to move this one down. Let's talk about the northern kingdom. So Jeroboam sets up the northern king in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 25 through 33. But he does three important things that set the trajectory of the northern kingdom. Now, this is the 10 tribes, right? First, he sets up the capital at Shechem or Samaria, that area right there. Okay, and that's going to become a major important thing. It's going to talk a lot about Samaria and Shechem as the capital of the northern kingdom. All right. But what he realizes is, all right, if all of these 10 tribes have to go down to Jerusalem to worship all the time, eventually they're going to transition their allegiance from me to Rehoboam. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it easy on them. I'm going to basically move the Jewish religion up north, but make it better. And so he fashions 2 golden calves. Have you ever heard of golden calves before? Here they are again. Okay. And he puts one at Dan, which is in the northern part, and one at Bethel, which is south. So basically, he's creating satellite campuses of Jerusalem so they don't have to travel as far. Does that make sense? And he basically tells them, hey guys, he was mean to you. He was going to be hard on you. I care about you. So I'm going to kind of make this easy on you guys. You don't have to travel as far. He chooses non-Levite priests. He basically appoints anybody to be priest, and he begins to offer sacrifices. He comes up with his own festivals. He basically imitates the Jewish religion, but moves it up north, makes it easier and more convenient, all in hope of gaining the loyalty of the people. But in so doing, he's being unfaithful to the God who lives in the temple in Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? Along with all of that, he sets up high places to worship the gods of the nations around him. Mm-hmm. So he's trying to be friends with everybody, and in so doing, he's lowering the standard of what it means to worship the God of Israel in Jerusalem. All right, any questions about that so far? All right, so this is the breakdown of how the tribes, okay, so you have the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom. You see Reuben, Gad, Asher, Naphtali, Dan, Manasseh, Simeon, Ephraim, Issachar, and Zebulun. Those are the 10 tribes that went to be a part of the northern kingdom. And then you have Judah, Benjamin, and Levi that were the tribes of the southern kingdom. Now, this is really confusing, I know. Let me just say this. Remember, Levi, those are the priests for Israel. So when there was an inheritance, when they went into the land and each tribe got a section of land as an inheritance, Levi didn't get any land. They were the priests for everybody. So they kind of lived all over, and they served as the priesthood. Well, when all this went down, most Levites begin to move to the south. Okay. Later on in 2 Chronicles, some of the other tribes are seeing how bad the northern kingdom is getting, like Ephraim, Simeon, Manasseh. They start to migrate down south as well. But this at the divide is the divided kingdom. Okay. Now, I know what you're thinking. Rich, there are 12 tribes. I'm not a genius at math, but there are 13 names on the screen. How on earth are there 13 names if there's only 12 tribes? Let's answer that question. So basically, when there are 12 patriarchs or 12 sons of Israel, okay? And that's, the ones you see there, Reuben, Simeon, and Levi, all of them. But remember that Joseph had two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And so when they went into the promised land, Ephraim and Manasseh were, instead of Joseph just having one tribe, they were actually recognized as separate tribes. Okay, well, now it's 13 tribes. There's only 12 sons, but 13 tribes. Then when they gave out the allotment of land, they only gave out 12 allotments because Levi did not get an allotment. Okay, so there are 12 territories. There are 12 sons of Israel, but technically there are 13 recognized tribes. Does that make sense? And that it's kind of fluid. There are times where some of the tribes kind of get intermeshed with other ones and that kind of stuff. But that's why sometimes it looks like 12, sometimes it looks like 13, sometimes it looks like 14 because they separated and all this stuff. But that's the tribes of Israel, okay? And this is how the divided kingdom happens, okay? Are there any questions up to this point? So why is this a big deal? If you look over in, let me get to where it is. Okay, look over in 1 Kings chapter 15. When you begin to look at these books, you start to see these lists of kings. And in 1 Kings 15, if yours has titles, you'll see in verse 1 it says Abijah, king of Judah. And then the next one is Asa, king of Judah. And the next one is Nadab, king of Israel. And then Baasha, king of Israel. And so what it's doing is it's listing out the kings for both the northern tribes called Israel and the southern tribes called Judah. Now this gets really confusing when you first start reading the Old Testament because the Bible talks about Israel. Sometimes it talks about it and it means both tribes. It means everybody, all right? Sometimes it talks about Israel and it means just these northern tribes. Sometimes it talks about Israel and it just means Judah. But sometimes it just talks about Judah, okay? And so it can get really confusing. Who's it talking about, okay? And a big part of understanding this is understanding when in the chronology it's talking. Anything up to this point, and it talks about Israel, it's talking about everybody because it was unified. It was all together. From this point on, you have to kind of look at these couple of hundred years. Who exactly is it talking about? Now, this is massive because if you look at this list of books, it's during this time that a lot of the prophets begin to happen, okay? And so who are the prophets talking to? Are they talking to just the northern kingdom? Are they talking to Judah? Who are the prophets talking to? Does that make sense? And so if you look here, there's a list of the northern and southern kingdoms. And my wife put this together. She did a great job. And this is when these kings reigned. And over here it has good, bad, kind of like a battery, positive, negative, right? Were these good kings or bad kings? From a godly perspective, not from a political perspective, right? And if you look down this side of Israel's kings, negative, 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 it did not go well. Yeah. Okay? You look in the Judah side, though, negative, negative, positive, positive, negative, negative, positive, positive, positive. You know what I mean? There are positive, there are good kings on that side. And so the spiritual trajectory of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom was slightly different. The spiritual trajectory of the southern kingdom was pretty much straight down from Jeroboam. It crashed and burned. Yeah. The spiritual trajectory of Judah kind of had its ups and downs and hung on for a little while and then ultimately crashed, which leads to the overtaking by the Assyrians and the Babylonians. And that's why the northern tribes are taken over first in 722, so they're earlier, and then the southern tribes around 120 to 150 years later, they're overtaken by Babylon. Okay, so let's stop there for a second. Any questions? Oh wait, no. Any questions about this so far? What was the question?
Yeah. Question. What was the year that the southern tribes were taken by Babylon? I got 722 for the northern tribes.
Yeah.
It was in 3 waves.
Yeah, there's 3 waves.
Okay.
So
605, 590, 605, 597, and ultimately 587.
Okay. I should remember that from when we were doing the earlier survey on, what was that? Gosh, I forgot the period, the exact name of it.
no worries. Okay, well let's
I got one.
what you got?
Jesus and Rehoboam are they in the same lineage?
Yes.
Or okay, I just want to make sure they were in the same lineage and it wasn't just like some other person in Judah and he was just over it.
Nope. Yeah, that's this is the lineage. Yeah. And some of these kings happen via lineage, and some of them happen via overtaking. And so there's kind of a mix, but Rehoboam is definitely through Solomon and in the lineage of Jesus. Okay.
The overtaking is much more prevalent in the northern kingdom in Israel. As I did a study of this time period, I noted it, and I think I counted 7 or 8 of these kings on the Israel side that those people overtook the throne. It was not by birth. So there you go.
Cool. All right. One other element of this time period of the divided kingdom that really comes on strong is the prophets. There are 2 main biographical prophets that become massive fixtures, and that is Elijah and Elisha. Now we know there were other prophets. Nathan the prophet calls out David. Ahijah the prophet talks to Jeroboam. So we know there were other prophets that existed, but Elijah and Elisha step on the scene and they are massive. And this picture is obviously Elijah at Mount Carmel. In the northern kingdom, they had established a whole system of Baal worship. They had hundreds and hundreds of prophets that the government was paying and they were feeding, right? And so on Mount Carmel, Elijah calls them all there, challenges them. You call down fire from heaven from your God. I'll call down fire from heaven from my God. And he, obviously they don't have a God, so he doesn't respond, or they don't respond. And then Elijah calls on Jehovah, and God sends fire from heaven and licks up the thing. And who knew Bernie was there? That's crazy. All right. The other part of it, though, is during this time, as I talked earlier, these 17 literary books, the literary prophets start, that they were also speaking, but they were also writing down things where Elijah and Elisha did not. So another element of this this time period, though, that Manny wants to talk about is.
Am I talking about the woman with Elijah, or you want me to talk about?
Oh, just a couple of them. Just do Jezebel first, and then.
Okay. So one of the really not great women in this time period is with King Ahab. Ahab marries a woman named Jezebel, who is daughter of King of Sidon, who actually that place was supposed to have been taken care of when they came into the promised land, and they didn't do their job. The Sidonians continued to live. Insert years later, Jezebel, who kills God's prophets. She threatens to kill more people. She leads her husband to kill people. She is just bad upon bad upon bad. She is not a highlight of women, but she is notable in that you see the train wreck that she is in the northern kingdom there in Israel. Can I talk about a couple
Yeah,
of
but
them?
yeah, go ahead.
Contrast that with, Elijah and Elisha. They are trying to preach to God's people to get them to repent. And obviously you can see the Israel side that went terribly. One of the cool things though that is highlighted in the Bible are two women in 2 Kings 4. You should read this on your own, but really amazing women of faith that they actually are living by faith and respect the prophets, and God really takes care of them. And
What's amazing about them is they're not Israelites.
yes. And their steps of faith are amazing, even more amazing because of that. And you see God's kindness towards them, really amazing faith building stories. So contrasting two characters of women.
Yeah, and it's interesting because they are kind of this highlight that if Israel would have just done what God was asking them to, they could have affected the nations in great ways.
Yep.
You know what I mean? And yet they chose to become like the nations, and that was the problem. They didn't drive these nations out, and they continue to be drawn towards those nations instead of being a light to the nations. So
God is always seeking hearts that are seeking him, though, and that's what's cool with these stories of those couple of women.
All right, well, what we're gonna do right now is take a little break, all right, and have you guys, we're gonna divide up into groups again, and we're gonna have you discuss how is the this idea of the divided kingdom that we're talking about, this time period, how is it different from the kingdom that we now have through Jesus? Okay, so what are some of the contrasts about what we saw in the north, in the divided kingdom, both north and south, and the kingdom that we now have as disciples through King Jesus? Cool. Any questions?
We'll take. How long did you say?
We'll just say like 10 minutes. How about that?
So, Rich, the question is, what's the similarities of the kingdom we have now and the two kingdoms of Israel?
What are the differences? Hopefully there's differences. Otherwise, I'm getting out of leadership now. All right, so we'll open it up about 7 minutes, and then we'll come back and close out. What are you doing?
I was trying to read the chat.
I was behind the thing.
Oh, which room do you want to join? We could join room 6 because it looks like Angie didn't join.
The leftovers. It's all right. That means ours is better.
Hey guys,
Hey,
what's going on? Aaron, are you sitting in a dark room?
I am. I enjoy the dark. The girls have every light on in the house.
Wow, that is really dark.
I have a heating pad, so I'm nice and warm and dark.
That's awesome. I'm glad you're cuddly. Okay, so how is the kingdom that we now have different than what we see in these divided kingdoms? What do you guys think? Any thoughts?
I mean, the first one that stands up to me is that we're not divided.
Yep, that's a good one.
That's what I was thinking too.
Yeah.
Yeah, the call to unity is such a priority in God's
Yeah.
kingdom, that it being about unification and relationships. And I love that. That's awesome.
We have Jesus as our king.
Perfect king.
Yeah.
You know, their kings, when they were good, they were good. When they were bad, they were bad. And ours is always good.
Yeah. Then it was like just so much. I mean, not everyone, obviously, but there were so many bad kings, I guess,
Mhm.
that things were so corrupt and so at times. And so now we don't have to worry about them anymore because Jesus doesn't change depending on the, the weather or the day or the feeling, the mood, that kind of thing. But he's just the same. And no matter if it was 100 years from ago or 100 years from now, the word doesn't change.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I love the in the old kingdom, it was trying to convince a group of people through birth and citizenship to be followers of God. And our kingdom isn't like that. It's not based on birth and citizenship, but it's based on new birth and therefore permeates every nation. It is a light to the nations. Mm-hmm. It does what a political organization is incapable of, because it's not trying to take people and kind of force them into it by birth. Mm-hmm. It's by faith. And so by faith, I'm born again, not kind of forced upon me.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking about how the kingdom at that time was geographic, and our kingdom spans, it's global, worldwide, all nations and languages and cultures, and which is really super cool.
Yeah. And the old kingdom was come here to Jerusalem, and ours is go there. Go out to all nations.
Yeah.
So lots of cool differences. Our kingdom is way better.
Totally. God knew that.
I know, right?
Definitely.
So we're gonna end the rooms here. So I'll put them together.
Oh, it's totally fine.
All right, let me see.
You asked us to look at surveillance near areas of the city link stops. We picked this up in the commuter parking lot.
You need that anymore?
Nope. Hey guys. All right, I think we're just waiting on one group.
There's one group who killed it.
This was harder. After you said a few things, you were straining to think of more.
Our group was awesome. Yeah, what were some of the ones? I'd love to hear some.
I said that the two kingdoms were hyper worldly, power, position, status. Was it Jeroboam wanted to hang on to the loyalty of his people, so he was willing to compromise. Ends justified the means, and he set up those false idols, and then sucked up to anybody else in the area to keep peace. And of course, with Christ, none of that. We're actually supposed to deny ourselves in anything worldly as much as possible, and focus on God and Him.
That's cool.
Catherine had a great.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Miko.
Catherine had a great thought of like these nations had a lot of imperfect kings, where we get to be under a kingdom of a perfect king.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's probably the best one, isn't it?
Yes. That's awesome.
One of the cool ones that came out with us is that for Israel, it was trying to influence the nations by saying, come here. And God's kingdom is a spiritual kingdom that says, where God says, no, go there. Go to all nations instead of trying to get all nations to come here. And so, there are many things better about our kingdom. All right, let's close out with just a couple kind of tail end of the timeline here. So now we come, let's look at our timeline. So we're through this period here. There's the divide in 930. You have the northern kingdom until 722, the southern kingdom until 586. And then you have your years of captivity here. This is called the exile. Okay. Some of the main players during this time, there's 3 nations, and this is important to understand that there's actually 3 kingdoms that are all north of Israel. So they're also called the northern kingdoms, which again can become confusing, or the kingdoms of the north. And those are Assyria, Babylon, and Medo-Persia. And they're basically the same area, but one kingdom would overcome the next kingdom. So it starts out where Assyria and their capital is Nineveh, and then Babylon comes in and takes them over, and they set up their capital in Nineveh, and then the Medo-Persian Empire takes over and they set up. So it's the same nation, it's just changing hands over the course of time. And so as you read it, you'll hear all 3 of those nations being mentioned. All 3 of those are the kingdom to the north that God uses to discipline the Israelites. All of Israel, both northern and southern kingdom. Main characters during that time. Daniel is a major player. He's from 604 to 535. He's actually in politics through both the Babylonian and the Medo-Persian Empire. And so you'll see in those books, there's different, there's the rise and fall of these 2 nations. And he is an incredibly faithful man. He's awesome. And as well as a prophet that begins to prophesy about future kingdoms in a great way.
And Esther, of course, we know the story of Esther, but and at this point where Esther steps in, the Jews are facing actually total annihilation, and God uses Esther in a tremendous way through the influence of her uncle to be able to step up with courage and saves her people, saves the Jews, and they continue. So amazing entire book of the Bible, actually, her whole story.
Yeah. And it's a cool picture of grace where God was disciplining them, but he was not okay with them being wiped out. And so Esther plays a super important role in keeping the nation from being completely annihilated under that empire. Okay. And then, so that's the exile period. Again, that's this period here. And then the last period of Old Testament history that we're going to discuss before we talk about the intertestamental period is the post-exile. Now, this is the series that we just got done doing over the summer. We studied the return under Zerubbabel and Joshua and Ezra to rebuild the temple. The temple was rebuilt in 516 BC. Then the next book of Nehemiah. During those books of Ezra, in the book of Ezra, we have the prophets of Haggai and Zechariah who prophesy to the returned exiles and encourage them in continuing to build the temple and reestablish the worship in Jerusalem. And then we have Nehemiah who comes and rebuilds the wall and the city to enhance the political power and the economic power of Israel once again in Jerusalem. So, and then the last book of the Bible from this period is the book of Malachi, where he is a prophet calling the people once again back to faithfulness. Okay? And so that's the very tail end of our chronology. So we've covered this period here tonight, the divided kingdom. We've covered the 70 years of captivity, the exile. We've covered the return and rebuilding here towards the end, which brings us to around 430 BC, which is right about when they date the book of Malachi. Okay? And so we wanted to do an overview. Again, the goal of all of this is so that when we read our Bibles and we pick up the Old Testament, we know where things go. We have kind of a framework, a chronological framework upon which to understand, okay, this prophet, well, these prophets were mostly during the captivity or mostly during the kings, or you know what I mean? We have an idea of who the audience is. When we look at the book of Kings, we understand, oh, there's a northern tribe, there's a southern tribe, and who those people are, who they're talking to. These are just important overarching frameworks for us to have as we read through the Old Testament. Cool? All right. Well, let me try and end the screen share without leaving the call. How did I do that?
Rich, do you care to send that timeline in the group me maybe?
Yes. Yeah, I can send that timeline. It's easy. As well, I actually have an Old Testament chronology that Brian Perkins did, and it's like super detailed. It has the political leaders of the other nations. It has, I mean, it's super thorough. And so if anyone's interested in that, let me know. It's a PDF. I can send that out as well. But that's like, I mean, obviously he's a doctor. That's like, it's super detailed. So if you're interested in that, let me know.
There's also the one that we
Oh man, hold on. There was one more that got suggested. Any questions about this or any thoughts about what we've talked about so far? Nothing?
no.
Hey, Rich,